There was a time in the mid-1980s when one face seemed to be everywhere. It was on movie posters, on magazine covers, and on the arm of a grinning Australian bushman who would go on to become one of the biggest comedy icons of the decade. That face belonged to Linda Kozlowski, the woman who played Sue Charlton in Crocodile Dundee, a role that turned her into an overnight sensation and, for a while, one of the most recognizable actresses on the planet. Then, almost as quickly as she arrived, she seemed to step out of the spotlight altogether. Fans who grew up watching her hold her own against a machete-wielding, city-slicker-baffling Paul Hogan haven't seen much of her since, and for years the question of what actually happened to her has floated around fan forums and nostalgia articles alike. So, what does she look like now, decades removed from that career-defining role, and what has she actually been doing with her life since the cameras stopped rolling? The real story is less about disappearing and more about a woman quietly choosing a different life on her own terms, one that most people would probably admire if they knew the details. Long before Hollywood knew her name, Linda Kozlowski was a working-class kid from Fairfield, Connecticut, born in January of 1958 to a mother of Polish descent and a father who kept the household grounded in practical values. She wasn't the product of a showbiz family or a childhood full of talent agents and auditions arranged by pushy stage parents. Instead, she found her way into performance through sheer curiosity and discipline, attending her local high school before setting her sights on something far more rigorous than the average acting hopeful's path. She earned a spot at the prestigious Juilliard School in New York, one of the most competitive and demanding performing arts conservatories in the country, where she studied drama seriously alongside classmates who would go on to become notable performers in their own right. She graduated with a degree in fine arts in 1981. Juilliard has a reputation for producing actors who take craft over glamour, favoring stagecraft, discipline, and range over marketability, and Kozlowski was very much shaped by that culture from the start. She cut her teeth off Broadway, appearing in a New York theater production early in her career, and picked up small television roles along the way, building a foundation the old-fashioned way through years of unglamorous work rather than a single lucky break. It was a slow, methodical climb, the kind actors rarely get credit for once a single blockbuster role rewrites their public story. That lucky break did eventually come, though nobody could have predicted how big it would be. In 1986, a modest Australian film called Crocodile Dundee was casting the female lead, an American reporter named Sue Charlton, who travels to the outback to interview a rugged crocodile hunter and ends up falling for him along the way. The role wasn't necessarily written with an unknown American stage actress in mind, but her audition impressed the filmmakers enough to cast her opposite Paul Hogan, a comedian who was, at the time, largely unknown outside of Australia, and who was stepping into his first major leading film role. Nobody involved could have guessed that the film would become a genuine cultural phenomenon, grossing hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide on what was, by Hollywood standards, a fairly modest budget, and turning both of its leads into instant international celebrities almost overnight. Kozlowski's performance as Sue Charlton, funny, sharp, and unexpectedly tender underneath the fish-out-of-water comedy, resonated with audiences everywhere. And within months, she went from a relatively unknown stage-trained actress working the New York theater circuit to a household name recognized on nearly every continent. The film would go on to pick up several award nominations, including a Golden Globe nomination for Kozlowski's own performance, a rare honor for an actress making her feature film debut. Fame arrived fast, and with it came a flood of magazine covers, talk show appearances, and the kind of media attention that can be intoxicating and exhausting in equal measure. Kozlowski became one of the defining faces of 1980s pop culture, but the same role that made her famous also came with a familiar Hollywood problem: typecasting. Interviewers wanted to talk about the woman from Crocodile Dundee, studios wanted more of the same character in different packaging, and Kozlowski, trained at one of the most rigorous acting conservatories in the country, found herself boxed into a single image rather than being given the range of roles her training had prepared her for. She did go on to appear in a handful of other films throughout the late 80s and 90s, including Crocodile Dundee 2, the horror remake Village of the Damned, and several smaller projects, but none of them came close to matching the cultural footprint of that first breakout role. Life off-screen was moving just as fast as life on it. The chemistry between Kozlowski and Hogan translated from the screen into real life, and the two married in 1990 for years after the original film's release and shortly after wrapping the sequel, Crocodile Dundee 2. It was, on paper, a Hollywood fairy tale. Two co-stars who fell in love while playing people falling in love, their off-screen romance mirroring the plot that had made them famous in the first place. The couple went on to have a son together, Chance, and for years they navigated marriage under the kind of public scrutiny that few relationships are built to withstand. Hogan, already an established comedic star with an enormous global following built over years of Australian television before Crocodile Dundee ever existed, brought his own level of fame into the marriage, and balancing two intertwined careers and two very public identities inside one household was never going to be simple. Being married to one of the most recognizable comedians in the world meant Kozlowski's own identity was frequently filtered through her husband's much larger public profile, something she reportedly found challenging to navigate, even as their family life continued largely out of the tabloid glare for long stretches. Like many long marriages that begin under intense public attention, theirs eventually reached a breaking point after more than 2 decades together. The couple separated in 2013 and officially divorced the following year, bringing a quiet end to a partnership that had once seemed like the ultimate Hollywood love story. Around the same period that her marriage was winding down, Kozlowski had already made a much quieter and in some ways more surprising decision. She walked away from acting altogether. Reports from the time indicate she became increasingly frustrated with the kinds of scripts she was being offered, describing a pattern of straight-to-video projects and roles that offered little room for growth as an actress. Rather than continuing to chase parts that didn't interest her, she chose to step back from the industry entirely around 2001. There was no public falling out, no scandal, and no dramatic farewell tour. She simply stopped taking roles and let her presence in Hollywood fade on its own terms, which in an industry built on constant visibility is its own kind of quiet rebellion. What she did next tells you a lot about who Linda Kozlowski actually is underneath the Sue Charlton persona that so many people associate with her. Rather than clinging to any remnant of celebrity or angling for a nostalgic comeback toward the way so many former stars eventually do, she built an entirely different life from the ground up. For a period, she worked as a licensed real estate agent, trading red carpets for open houses and swapping movie sets for property listings, a career about as far removed from Hollywood glamour as one could imagine, and one that required its own kind of licensing, training, and patience. Eventually, her path took an even more unexpected turn. She remarried in 2017, this time to a man named Malay Hafid Baba, and the couple went on to build a life and a business together in Morocco, a country neither of them had any obvious professional connection to before their relationship began. Together they run a travel and tour company called Dream My Destiny, guiding visitors through a country that couldn't be further removed from the Los Angeles industry that once defined her public image, curating trips through markets, deserts, and coastal towns rather than negotiating scripts or fielding calls from casting directors. It's the kind of second act that rarely gets headlines precisely because it isn't chasing them, built around clients and itineraries rather than premieres and press junkets. Photographs of Kozlowski from recent years show a woman who looks confident, healthy, and by most accounts, genuinely content, still recognizable as the actress from Crocodile Dundee, but visibly living on her own schedule rather than a studio's. She has continued to share glimpses of her life through social media, offering fans an occasional window into a world built around travel, her business in Morocco, and a life that looks nothing like the one she left behind in Hollywood. There's something almost disarming about seeing someone once so tightly associated with a single blockbuster image now running a small tourism company on another continent. It's a reminder that the public version of a celebrity frozen in whatever role made them famous is almost never the whole story. What makes Kozlowski's story worth revisiting isn't scandal or tragedy. It's the simple fact that she did something many famous people struggle to do, which is leave. Hollywood has no shortage of actors who spend years chasing the version of themselves that made headlines decades earlier, hoping for a comeback that will restore the spotlight they once had. Kozlowski took the opposite approach. She built her career carefully through years of stage training, hit an extraordinary peak with a role that became a piece of pop culture history, recognized when that role had become a professional ceiling rather than a stepping stone, and then walked away to build something entirely her own. That's a different kind of success story than the one Hollywood usually tells, but it might be a more honest one. It's also worth remembering just how significant Crocodile Dundee actually was and still is in the broader landscape of 1980s film. The movie was nominated for several major awards, including a Golden Globe nomination for Kozlowski herself. And it remains one of the most commercially successful comedies of its era, spawning 2 sequels and cementing both of its stars as recognizable figures well beyond the world of film critics and industry insiders. For Kozlowski, that kind of overnight global recognition came with real trade-offs. She has spoken in past interviews about the challenge of being seen primarily as a character rather than as an actress with range, a frustration shared by plenty of performers who become permanently linked to a single iconic role. Few of them, though, respond to that frustration by quietly building a completely new career on another continent. There's also something worth noting in how differently Kozlowski's exit from Hollywood reads compared to the exits of so many other former stars. There was no public meltdown, no tell-all memoir dragging her ex-husband through the mud, and no desperate late-career attempt to stay relevant through reality television or tabloid controversy. Her divorce from Paul Hogan, while certainly a major life event after more than 2 decades of marriage, was handled with relatively little public drama given how much attention the couple had once attracted. Hogan, for his part, has continued to make occasional public appearances over the years, while Kozlowski has largely let her post-Hollywood life speak for itself through the tour company she now runs rather than through interviews or press tours. At a point in life when many former stars are either fighting to stay visible or fading quietly into obscurity out of necessity rather than choice, Linda Kozlowski represents something a little different, a deliberate, self-directed reinvention. She isn't hiding, and she isn't chasing a comeback either. She's simply living a life she chose for herself, one built around travel, entrepreneurship, and a marriage far removed from the one that once made international headlines. For the millions of people who grew up watching her outrun crocodiles and hold her own against Paul Hogan's larger-than-life screen presence, seeing where she is now might come as a surprise, but it shouldn't really. It's what happens when someone decides that a single famous role doesn't have to define the rest of their life.